Welcome to the story. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and support me. The rain came down in sheets as Arthur guided his horse through the narrow mountain pass. The path ahead was barely visible, shrouded in mist, while jagged rocks jutted out like teeth from the mountainside. His cloak clung to him, drenched through despite the heavy fabric, and his boots felt as though they were filled with leaves. Yet Arthur pushed forward, the weight of duty far heavier than the elements assaulting him. He had received the summons just a fortnight ago. The 5 kingdoms, long divided by old grudges and bitter wars, had no choice but to form an alliance. A threat loomed in the east. The Crimson Horde and its war drums were growing louder. King Alden of Candor Arthur's liege had ordered him to travel to the newly formed Council of the Alliance as an envoy. His mission was clear: maintain the fragile peace between the kingdoms, but above all, ensure Candor's interests were upheld. Arthur pulled his horse to a halt at the ridge of the pass. From here, the valley stretched below, dotted with the banners and tents of the Alliance army. Thousands of soldiers gathered, a patchwork of colors and crests representing the 5 kingdoms: Candor, Vanir, Farin, Silas, and Westra. Arthur's eyes were drawn to the largest tent at the center, where the rulers were meeting. "Hold, boy," Arthur muttered to his horse, patting its damp neck. He took a deep breath and urged the beast forward, descending the narrow trail toward the camp. The closer he came, the more palpable the tension grew. Soldiers from different kingdoms eyed each other warily, hands never far from sword hilt. Old rivalries were hard to bury, even with the Crimson Horde pressing at their border. Arthur could feel the weight of their mistrust like a noose tightening around his neck. As he approached the council's tent, 2 guards bearing the crest of Allure stopped him. "State your name and purpose." One of the guards barked, his hand resting on the pommel of his sword. "Arthur of Candor," he replied calmly, despite the animosity in the guard's eyes, "envoy to the Alliance." The guard glanced at his companion before stepping aside. They're re-waiting inside. Arthur dismounted, handing his reins to a nearby stable boy. He paused at the entrance to the tent, his hand lingering on the flap for a moment. The weight of what awaited him inside seemed heavier than ever. Inside the tent, a large table dominated the space, surrounded by the rulers of the 5 kingdoms. King Alden of Candor sat at the far end, his lined face a mask of exhaustion. Beside him, Queen Seraphine of Allure looked every bit the political viper she was known to be, her green eyes gleaming with ambition. Duke Lothar of Tharin sat stiffly in his chair, his broad shoulders tense as if he was ready to leap into battle at any moment. Across from him, Lady Elara of Vostria radiated calm authority, though her gaze was wary. Prince Doran of Silas, the youngest of the rulers, seemed out of place, his youth betraying his inexperience. Arthur cleared his throat as he stepped forward. "Your Majesties, my lords," he began, bowing his head in respect. King Alden waved a hand. "Arthur, take a seat. We were just discussing the recent reports from the Eastern Front." Arthur sat down, feeling the weight of their gazes upon him. "What news?" Queen Seraphine spoke first, her voice smooth and measured. "The Crimson Horde has attacked one of the border villages in Silas. It was a test, a way to gauge our defenses." Prince Doran shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "My scouts report that they have more troops than we anticipated. They're moving faster than we thought." "They've been preparing for this for years," Duke Lothar growled. "Well, we've been bickering over borders and trade routes. They've been building an army." Arthur nodded. The Crimson Horde was unlike any enemy they had faced before. They were a disciplined, merciless force equipped with strange weapons and tactics that had confounded the Western kingdoms at every turn. The Horde was not just interested in conquest. They sought to erase the cultures and peoples they conquered, leaving nothing but ash in their wake. "Then we must act now," Queen Seraphine said, her gaze sweeping the room. "Strike before they strike again." Duke Lothar's lips twisted into a sneer. "And who will lead this attack?" "Yeah, Seraphine, you've never held a sword in your life." Queen Seraphine's eyes flashed, but her voice remained cool. "I may not be a soldier, but I understand strategy. More than can be said for some of us." Arthur saw the tension mounting, and his stomach churned. The alliance was already fraying, and they had only just begun. If this bickering continued, they would be easy prey for the Crimson Horde. "Enough," King Alden interjected, his voice sharp. "This is no time for petty arguments. We must present a united front, or we will all fall." The tent fell into a heavy silence. Arthur leaned forward, his mind racing. How could they possibly hold this alliance together when mistrust ran so deep? Every kingdom had its own agenda, its own ambition. Seraphine clearly wanted more than just survival. She wanted to expand her influence. Lothar was too proud and suspicious to trust anyone, let alone a rival like Seraphine. And Doran, well, Doran was simply too inexperienced to navigate these treacherous waters. I propose we send a joint force to the Eastern Front, Arthur said, breaking the silence. A show of strength, let the Crimson Horde know that we are united. Queen Seraphine raised an eyebrow. And who will lead this force, you, Arthur? Arthur met her gaze steadily. If it comes to that, I will. But I believe this should be a decision we make together. King Alden nodded. His expression approving. Arthur is right. We must act as one. I will commit Candor's forces to this endeavor. What say the rest of you? Duke Lothar grunted. Thorin will send soldiers, but if I catch even a whiff of treachery... You will do what, Lothar? Seraphine interrupted, with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. We're all in this together, remember? Arthur's eyes flickered toward Lady Elara of all the rulers. She seemed the most level-headed, the most concerned with the greater good. She had remained quiet during the argument, but now she spoke, her voice measured and calm. Westria will stand with candor, she said, but we must tread carefully. The Crimson Horde will exploit any weakness, any division. Arthur felt a flicker of hope. Lady Elara's support could be the key to holding the alliance together. But as the meeting continued, he couldn't shake the feeling that they were walking a tightrope, and one wrong step could send them all plummeting into chaos. The camp was a buzz of activity by the time Arthur emerged from the tent. Soldiers were sharpening weapons, reinforcing armor, and preparing for the battle to come. But beneath the surface, he could feel the unease gnawing at them all. As Arthur made his way toward the edge of the camp, he spotted Lady Elara standing by the watchtower, her cloak billowing in the wind. She was staring out toward the east, where the Crimson Horde was gathering. Arthur hesitated for a moment before approaching her. My lady, he said, inclining his head in greeting. Lady Elotha turned to him, her expression thoughtful. Arthur. They stood in silence for a moment, the wind tugging at their cloak. Finally, Arthur spoke. Do you think we can hold this alliance together? Lady Elara's lips curved into a sad smile. I think we can try. But it won't be easy. The rulers of these kingdoms have never trusted each other, and old grudges are hard to forget. Arthur nodded. I worry that Seraphine and Lothar are playing their own game. They are more interested in power than in defeating the Crimson Horde. Lady Elara's eyes darkened. We're not wrong, but we can't let that stop us. If the alliance falls apart, the Horde will sweep through our lands like wildfire, and there will be nothing left to say. Arthur clenched his fists, his mind swirling with doubts. What if we fail? We can't afford to think that way, Lady Elara said softly. We have to believe that we can win, and we have to be willing to make sacrifices. Arthur met her gaze, feeling a strange sense of calm settle over him. Lady Elara was right. They couldn't allow fear and doubt to paralyze them. They had to move forward, even if the path ahead was uncertain. I'll do whatever it takes to protect Candor, Arthur said quietly. Lady Elara's eyes softened. I know you will, but remember, this isn't just about Candor, it's about all of us. If we can stand together, we'll fall alone. Arthur nodded, but a part of him couldn't shake the feeling that they were already on the brink of disaster. The next morning, the army began its march toward the Eastern Front. Arthur rode at the head of the Candorian forces, his eyes scanning the horizon for any sign of the Crimson Horde. The other kingdoms' armies marched alongside them, but Arthur could sense the tension in the air. Soldiers from different kingdoms exchanged wary glances, their hands never far from their weapons. As they approached the border village where the Crimson Horde had struck, the smell of smoke and death filled the air. The village was a smoldering ruin, its buildings reduced to ash and rubble. Bodies lay strewn across the ground, victims of the Horde's brutal assault. Arthur dismounted, his heart heavy, as he surveyed the destruction. The Crimson Horde had left nothing standing, no homes, no livestock, no survivor. It was a message clear and terrifying. The Horde was coming, and they would show no mercy. Arthur knelt beside the bodies of the fallen villagers, his heart sinking with every breath. The Crimson Horde had left nothing but devastation in their wake-charred homes, twisted corpses, and the stench of death. His gloved hand brushed against the remnants of a tattered banner, its once bright colors now blackened by ash. This was not just an attack, it was a statement, a cruel reminder of what awaited them if they failed to unite. He rose to his feet, the weight of his armor heavy, though not as heavy as the burden on his soul. Around him, soldiers from the Alliance sources surveyed the destruction with grim faces. Some muttered prayers to their gods, others tightened their grips on their weapons as if preparing for the inevitable battle ahead. But Arthur knew their resolve was fragile. The Alliance hung by a thread, and it was only a matter of time before that thread snapped. Queen Seraphine rode up beside him, her cloak fluttering in the wind. She gazed down at the bodies with a cool detachment that unsettled Arthur. "It's so worse than I expected," she said, her voice devoid of emotion. Arthur glanced at her, struggling to hide his disdain. These were innocent people. They didn't stand a chance. Seraphine shrugged. Innocence is irrelevant in war. The Crimson Horde doesn't care who they kill. "That doesn't mean we have to be as cold," Arthur retorted, turning away from her. Seraphine's lips curled into a faint smile. "Idealism is admirable, Arthur, but it won us this war." Arthur clenched his jaw, biting back a retort. Seraphine's ambition was clear. She cared more about securing her kingdom as future than about the Alliance survival. But now wasn't time to confront her. They needed to focus on the greater threat. The Crimson Horde was advancing, and the Alliance had to hold. As Arthur walked through the remains of the village, he noticed Lady Alara standing near the edge of the ruins, her brow furrowed in thought. She was speaking softly with a group of her soldiers, pointing out areas where they might fortify their defenses. Even in the face of such devastation, she remained composed, focused. Arthur approached her, grateful for the sense of calm she always seemed to exude. "My lady," he greeted, his voice quiet. Lady Alara turned to him, her eyes softening when they met his. "Arthur, this is worse than we anticipated." "Yes," he replied, his voice tinged with sorrow. "They left no survivor." She sighed, looking toward the horizon where the dark clouds loomed. "The Horde is trying to break our spirit before the battle even begins." Arthur nodded. "And they might succeed if we don't find a way to unite the kingdom." Lady Alara's gaze drifted toward the others, Seraphine, Lothar, and the rest of the rulers, each lost in their own thoughts, their own agenda. "We have to make them see that this isn't about power or ambition, it's all about survival." Arthur admired her clarity of purpose, but he also knew how deeply entrenched the rivalries were. Still, he couldn't let the Alliance fall apart. Too much was at stake. "We'll find a way," Arthur said, more to convince himself than her. The days that followed were tense as the army continued its march toward the Eastern Front. Every mile they crossed brought them closer to the inevitable clash with the Crimson Horde, and every step seemed to deepen the cracks within the Alliance. There were whispers among the soldiers, whispers of betrayal, of alliances made in secret, of ambitions that threatened to unravel their fragile unity. Arthur kept to himself, focusing on his duties as an envoy and commander, but the weight of suspicion bore down on him. He couldn't ignore the signs. The way Seraphina's soldiers seemed to move with more autonomy than the others. The whispers between Lothar's men, the subtle but palpable tension that radiated from the rank. Even Lady Alara, despite her best efforts to maintain order, seemed troubled by the undercurrents of distrust. It wasn't until they reached the foothills near the eastern border that the first real cracks in the Alliance began to show. Scouts from Westria returned with grim news. A large force of the Crimson Horde was advancing rapidly, more organized and better equipped than they had anticipated. The Alliance would have to make their stand here, or risk being overrun. As the leaders gathered to discuss strategy, the tension in the air was almost unbearable. Arthur stood by King Alden's side, listening as the rulers debated their next move. "We should launch a full assault," Seraphine said, her voice sharp. "Strike hard, strike fast. If we wait, they'll all crush us." Duke Lothar crossed his arms over his broad chest, his eyes narrowing. "And who will lead this glorious assault? You, Seraphine? Or do you plan to sit behind the lines while the rest of us fight your battles for you?" Seraphine's eyes flashed dangerously. "I may not be a warrior, Lothar, but I understand strategy more than I can say for you." Lothar took a step toward her, his hand resting on the hilt of his sword. "Watch your tongue, woman, if you think..." "Enough," King Alden interrupted, his voice firm. "This is no time for petty squabbles. We need to focus on the real enemy." Arthur felt the weight of the moment pressing down on him. They were on the verge of battle, and yet they were more divided than ever. He looked to Lady Alara, hoping for some sign of unity, but even she seemed weary, her face drawn with worry. Arthur stepped forward, his voice steady, despite the turmoil in his chest. We can try afford to fight amongst ourselves. If we don't stand together, the Crimson Horde will destroy us all. We need a plan that unites us, not divides us. Seraphine glanced at him, her lips twisting into a cold smile. And what do you propose, Arthur, that we hold hands and sing songs of unity while the Horde marches over our corpses? Arthur met her gaze, refusing to be cowed. I propose that we set aside our differences and fight as one. We need to divide our forces, strategically hit the Horde from multiple fronts, draw them out, and force them into a position where they can too concentrate their strength. Lothar snorted. And who decides where we strike you? Arthur's patience was wearing thin, but he held his ground. We decide together as a council. This isn't about one kingdom or one ruler. It's about all of us. Lady Elena spoke up, her voice calm but firm. Arthur sighs, all right. We need to act as one. The Crimson Horde is counting on us to be divided. If we give in to that, we've then already lost. There was a long, tense silence as the leaders weighed their option. Finally, King Alden nodded. Very well, we'll follow Arthur's plan. But if this fails, he didn't finish the sentence, but the unspoken threat hung in the air like a blade poised to strike. The next morning, the Alliance forces moved into position. Arthur rode alongside his men, his mind focused on the task ahead. The plan was simple: draw the Crimson Horde into a narrow pass where their numbers would be less of an advantage, then strike from both sides, cutting them off and forcing them into a retreat. It was risky, but it was the best chance they had. As the hours passed, the tension in the air grew thicker until it felt like the very earth beneath them was trembling in anticipation. And then in the distance, the first faint sound of drums echoed across the hills, the war drums of the Crimson Horde. Arthur Sa's heart raced as he watched the enemy's dance army crest the horizon. They were a fearsome sight, thousands upon thousands of warriors clad in dark armor that seemed to absorb the light, their banners emblazoned with the blood-red sigil of the Horde. At their head rode General Rhaegar, his armor gleaming like polished obsidian, his face hidden behind a fearsome helmet. Arthur glanced at the soldiers around him. They were tense, their faces pale, but they stood firm. He had to trust that they would hold. They had no choice. The drums grew louder, and then with a deafening roar, the Crimson Horde charged. The battle erupted in a fury of steel and blood. Arthur's sword flashed in the sunlight as he cut down the first of the Horde's warriors, his movements fluid and precise. All around him, the clash of weapons and the cries of the dying filled the air, a cacophony of chaos and death. The plan was holding, for now the Horde was funneled into the pass, their numbers limited by the terrain, but it was only a matter of time before they adapted. As Arthur fought, his mind raced. Where was Seraphine's army? Lothar's forces were holding the left flank, but he hadn't seen any sign of Vler's troop. A sick feeling settled in his gut. Had Seraphine betrayed them? Was this all part of her plan? Suddenly, a horn sounded from the distance, and Arthur Estor's fears were confirmed. Vler's forces appeared on the ridge above, not to reinforce the alliance, but to strike from behind. Seraphine had made a deal with the Crimson Horde, and now she was turning on her ally. Arthur's blood ran cold as he realized the full extent of the betrayal. They were surrounded, trapped between the Horde and Vler's army. The alliance was falling apart, just as he had feared. There was no time to think, no time to plan. Arthur raised his sword, rallying the soldiers around him. Hold the line, Dontra, let them break through. But even as he shouted the words, he knew it was futile. The Horde was pressing harder, and now Vler's forces were attacking from the rear. They were being crushed on both sides. Arthur fought with every ounce of strength he had, but the tide was turning against them. Soldiers were falling all around him, their blood soaking the earth. He could feel the exhaustion setting in, his muscles screaming in protest with every swing of his sword. And then in the midst of the chaos, he saw her lady Alara standing tall amidst the carnage, her eyes blazing with determination. She was rallying her soldiers, trying to hold the line, even as the battle crumbled around them. Arthur pushed through the chaos, cutting a path toward her. Alara, he called out, his voice hoarse. She turned to him, her face streaked with blood and sweat. Arthur, we have to fall back. He nodded, his heart pounding. We can hold this position. We were being overwhelmed. Together, they fought their way back toward the rear of the army, but the situation was dire. The horde was closing in, and the Lursav forces were cutting off their retreat. Arthur's mind raced as he searched for a way out. They couldn't win this battle, not like that. But they had to survive, they had to regroup, find a way to rebuild the alliance before it was too late. As they neared the edge of the battlefield, Arthur spotted an opening, a narrow ravine that led deeper into the mountains. It wasn't much, but it was their only chance. This way, she shouted, grabbing Alira's arm and pulling her toward the ravine. They ran, the sounds of battle fading behind them as they slipped into the shadows of the mountains. Arthur didn't look back. He couldn't. They had lost the battle, but the war wasn't over, not yet.